listen. You know they call Callisto the dead, Moon. Dead. Just like you would have been if I hadn't fished you out of that wreck. I mean, shit. As far as anyone else is concerned, you are dead. It's time you moved on. Because you're crossing over to a new kingdom.
No.
My kingdom.
No.
So whatever it is you're holding on to right there, that's your old life. You gotta let that go. Because your new life is entirely in my hands. Surprise, Deadman!
After playing the first 4 hours of the Callisto Protocol, I was a fan. At that point in the game there were some issues, but overall I loved the look and feel, the atmosphere and the combat system. The latter felt tough but worth persevering with, and it felt satisfyingly brutal and impactful. Having completed it, my opinion hasn't gone completely in the opposite direction. I don't hate the game or think it's the worst thing ever made, but it does have some serious problems and I've definitely soured on it. Before we get into that, just to mention that I played the game on PS5, so I never faced the issues the PC players had with stuttering and frame rates. Performance mode generally worked fine and didn't cause any problems with gameplay. I did have one crash, and there were a few times where the pop-ins were extremely noticeable, or where Jacob pulled a switch and then teleported a few inches off the ground to fall back down, but that was the extent of it as far as the technical issues. Hopefully they'll get this game working better on PC, but that might be a reason to hold off buying it at least for a little while. As for the game itself, despite marketing itself as such, the Callisto Protocol is not survival horror. This doesn't automatically make the game bad, and isn't necessarily a mark against it, or if you're expecting the survival horror gameplay loop of backtracking, exploration, resource management and decisions on when to avoid or engage enemies, you won't get that here. This is a very linear experience where you're constantly moving forward and fighting pretty much everything that crosses your path. There are some survival horror elements in the game, particularly a limited inventory. In the first half of the game you have 6 item slots for non-weapon items, and in the second you have 12, meaning that you might have to drop or use an item to pick another one up, but there aren't really huge significant decisions on inventory to be made here. Ironically, it's once you have more inventory space that you're more likely to struggle for ammo and healing items. You also have a couple of areas where you have to explore one section to get a key item, then make your way back through to use it, or you have optional paths that can yield extra loot but with the risk of additional enemies, but there's no open hub area to explore, and once you pass through doors, crawl spaces or narrow passages to get to the next area, you're pretty much not going back. As I said, this isn't a bad thing. The linearity of the game is fine, and it does allow you to pass through a variety of environments rather than walk in the same few corridors which, without any real puzzles to speak of, would get old very fast. Instead, as you enter each area, the tasks you need to undertake to progress are fairly simplistic, and what you really keep in focus on is how you can manage any upcoming combat. The Callisto Protocol's combat is less third-person shooter and more heavy brawler. You have guns, and you get more and can upgrade them as the game goes on, but the game isn't excessively generous when it comes to ammo. The combat system incentivizes using guns for quick finishes or to manage your opponents rather than just to aim and shoot at everything that comes your way. Instead, for a lot of battles, you need to get up close and personal. This is where the game's melee system comes in. When an enemy swings at you, you need to hold left or right on the left stick to dodge. It doesn't matter which direction, but to dodge the next attack in sequence you need to push it in the other direction. This can feel a bit weird at first, but it's deceptively simple to get used to. Then, once you have an opening, you bash your opponent with your melee weapon. If you stun them enough, the game prompts you to aim and fire, guaranteeing a knockdown hit. As the game progresses, you realise that enemies losing limbs, even their heads, doesn't stop them coming. You have to get them down, unmoving, and stomp on them to get resources from them. If you see tentacles, shooting them quickly also guarantees an insta-kill, and in some cases you can also be quick enough with melee to kill and stomp before they mutate, but once they do mutate, they become bigger, tougher, and more aggressive. This system works really well in one-on-one encounters. There's a satisfying crunch to it. When there are multiple enemies, it becomes more important to manage the encounter, as going toe-to-toe with one enemy locks you into that fight and leaves you extremely vulnerable to being overwhelmed by others. This is where the combat system starts to feel more like a slog. With 2 or 3 foes it's manageable, but once you're dealing with more or with waves, then it becomes exhausting and frustrating very quickly. One of the items you get that offsets this is called a grip, basically a glove that lets you pull enemies or objects to you and fling them away with artificial gravity. Throwing items at enemies can knock them over, throwing explosive items can kill them, and throwing the enemies themselves can give you space to breathe, injure them if the grip is upgraded enough, or kill them if you send them into any of the gory hazards built into the level such as rotor blades and walls of spikes. Or even just fling them into the abyss. It doesn't always work as expected, because it seems the system wasn't designed with angles or precision in mind. It's too easy to pick up an object next to an enemy instead of the enemy, or have their propulsion into a wall of doom halted by the slightest environmental edge if you're at the wrong angle. However, On the whole, it's a very useful and satisfying addition to combat. On the other hand, weapon switching in the game is terrible. This isn't noticeable at first when you have one gun or even two, but beyond that it's just really bad. There is a quick swap by pressing the left directional button, but even when you have 4 guns, that will only swap between 2, and you don't seem able to even change which 2 it swaps between. Pressing right on the D-pad will show you all your guns, but it's just a vertical list you have to scroll down and then press X to choose, triggering a very slow weapon swap animation. Time doesn't even slow down when you're doing this, so running out of ammo for one gun in combat can just become a fiddly, frustrating mess. And of course you can't just change weapons in the inventory, as that doesn't pause gameplay either. It would have been far simpler to allow the players to map weapons to the D-pad, but if the developers really insisted on keeping down as the button to heal, a weapon wheel and a couple of seconds of slowed down time would work as well, given how many other games implement that system. Healing too is a pain in the arse. It's easier to heal on the fly in a Dark Souls boss fight than in the Callisto Protocol for the time that Jacob takes going through the animation, including taking a second or so to just look at the heal before using it. Fallen enemies can drop health, which is faster, but it's by no means guaranteed, and of no use in a one-on-one boss fight. Speaking of boss fights, this is another area where the combat goes from fun to frustrating. The footage of these doesn't spoil the story, but if you don't want to see the boss fights before you face them, then look away now. I'll tell you when it's safe to look again, or you can just skip ahead with the timestamps in the description. The first boss, and his slightly lower HP mini-boss clones later, requires you to dodge his attacks as they are one-hit kills and shoot in the openings you get, which is fine as a concept, except that the game forcibly keeps you at close range. If you manage to back away too much, it'll just stop registering your movement, and if you turn and run, you'll get instantly slaughtered. This makes it an exercise in precision which still might not be the worst thing in the world, if not for how utterly terrible weapon switching is, and the fact that you will invariably not have enough ammo left after the last encounter immediately before to take him out with one gun. When a couple of the mini-boss versions add in additional enemies too, with the problem that dodging or attacking them means you're not dodging the one-hit kills, their lower HP doesn't do much to mitigate the frustrations. It would definitely be improved by the boss fights not forcing proximity, and instead allowed you to make better use of the arena and obstacles you could throw at them, as well as getting close and dodging. Between that and an improved weapon switching system, these fights could be something great. 2 other boss fights involve a sequence of dodging swings before you get an opening to retaliate. These don't just go on for way too long, but it was also noticeable at points that even when I did dodge, the game just decided to hit me anyway, or a couple of times it didn't acknowledge that I had swung the stick the other way and hit me. It felt like the game was one of those dads who gets angry when forced to let his kids win, so he goes over the top to beat them and assert his dominance. You can look again now. Beyond the boss fights, the only real variety in the combat comes from a section where the enemies are blind and you have to move stealthily to stab them from behind. These enemies will walk in weird, jerky patterns and pop out of random crevices, testing your resolve to stay quiet and not jump into loud combat through panic. This is actually a fun and interesting section, but it overstays its welcome by at least 30 minutes, at which point the absurd loudness of the stealth kills goes from funny and slightly ridiculous to tired. It would have been far better to mix up the encounters so the forced stealth is minimal, and areas where you can choose to go loud or use stealth are more evenly distributed across the game. There's a lot to love in the combat overall, but also a few areas which clearly needed a lot more refinement. The deliberate heaviness of fights and movements is a good design choice, but also one that would land better if the devs were more flexible with it for specific scenarios. One of the things that does prop up the game is its story and presentation. It looks absolutely gorgeous, with an incredible level of photorealism and fidelity to the characters that makes you feel as though you're watching a movie. The plot revolves around cargo pilot Jacob crashing on Jupiter's moon Callisto after his ship is attacked by a terrorist group, only for both him and the terrorist leader to be summarily locked away in Black Iron Prison until some sort of outbreak leads to their escape. Jacob is from the outset a man who is hiding something, and the narrative of terrorism isn't all it seems. As we dig deeper, we get hints of the kind of corporate dystopia common in space horror all the way back to Alien, and later on even mention of secret powers behind them pulling the strings. But although it's well acted and there's some good world building, not too much of it is expanded upon in the main plot, which feels as though it ends without any proper resolution to the big questions underpinning why all of this happened to begin with. Given that the Season Pass promises not only additional gameplay modes but also a story DLC, it does feel like the narrative is pulling its punches for the sake of monetization, which is a shame. Not just story either, as the other things you pay for, such as ultra-hard contagion difficulty, permadeath and a wave survival mode, are all things that other games have included for free. This kind of thing has become par for the course in multiplayers by now, but the idea of it creeping into single-player story-based games and watering down good stories in the name of content and drawing extra cash out of players, when games already cost up to £70, is definitely not something we ought to be encouraging at all. At least we won't have to pay for New Game Plus when that finally arrives. though it's not clear why that wasn't planned to be included with the initial release, especially with upgrades as a key part of the game's systems. In accessibility too, the game shows a lot of potential before presenting some serious shortcomings. There are options such as customizing the subtitles, including the welcome addition of a dyslexia-friendly font, high contrast mode, auto-completion of QTEs, and some combat accessibility. But the lack of full controller remapping means that the amount the game relies on dodging will make it unplayable for players who struggle with motor functions. The closeness of the camera and the lack of options to address this will also make it a problem for anyone who struggles with motion sickness. This might be more forgivable for an indie studio, as I've mentioned in reviews of games by smaller teams and on smaller budgets, but here it feels as though an awful lot more could have been done. I had really high expectations ahead of the Callisto Protocol's release. I wanted this game to not just be good, but to potentially be my favourite game of the year. It's definitely not that. It's not a bad game by any means, but it is a very mixed experience. The combat is great for individual and smaller encounters, but that design gets in your way when faced with larger groups. The boss fights feel like you've been forced into cinematic set pieces that the mechanics simply aren't suited for. Weapon switching in particular is the biggest hang-up of the game and one of the main reasons that these situations aren't as fun as they might otherwise be. It feels as though more testing and polish was needed before putting it out into the world, and the incredible graphical fidelity cannot mask that, whilst the paywalling of content that other games have provided free behind a battle pass points in the direction that nobody should welcome for single-player games. Let me know what you think in the comments. Did you have a different experience than me? Are you enjoying it, or do you think it's not worth your time? If you've yet to buy it, are you going to give it a try or not? If you enjoyed this video, then give it a like and consider subscribing to keep up to date with all my content, like the video that's just popped up, which YouTube thinks you should watch next. Check out the links in the description to join my Patreon for as little as £1 per month, or donate to my GoFundMe and get your name in the credits of my videos, like those rolling up now, who will want to thank for supporting me and my content. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.